model, but really a way to try and learn from what it tells you in the form of an installation, a working model that tells you what to do next. So if I were to just throw a question out to go around to start the conversation, would somebody be willing to take a microphone and say what your biggest failure has been at this point with the work? We've seen what things can do. We've seen some success. We've seen how one project has led to another. What did any of you try and do that was just an absolute catastrophe? To think of it, to then be thinking of it as the designer of a machine or an inventor and not simply as an architect, which is supposed to live his or her life going from one success to the next.
We are all successful.
100% success. Well, then we'll open this up to the floor later to see if anybody else has suggestions on success and failure. But seriously, were there kinds of projects that you haven't had a chance yet to realize? I mean, if one looks at the last 10 to 15 years, what we see is obviously a growing complexity of the way in which some forms of technology can talk to others, and the way in which some sorts of installations can provide feedback to users and the experiencers of these things that have worked to varying degrees of success. But have there been moments in the various bodies of work where you kind of came across a crucial failure that might have then sent the work moving in a slightly different direction?
But I think actually it's good if machine fail. You know, if you think about machines and humans together, and if you think about John Fraser's idea of evolution, you think about machines as part of the outside world, and you know, and through evolution needs failure. Otherwise, you don't have that. And personally, so I actually one failure that was evolutionarily very interesting was I was mentioning before with the digital water pavilion. So everything programmed in order to have all the sensors, hundreds of sensors, react to the people, and then one day, as we say, you know, that doesn't work, and you think it's catastrophe, and actually it's much better because people love the pavilion more, and they like to, instead of having something that simply responds to them in a passive way, they like to engage with the building as if they were engaging with something living. So they try to sneak into the water without getting wet in this sense. So, I mean, we had many other failures. Usually when we do projects like the MoMA or the Venice Biennale, the Pavilion of the Venice Biennale, we had a backup system. So if the data doesn't arrive, everything is real time. The data comes from the city, goes to MIT, and then it's transferred to the Venice Biennale in real time. But especially in Venice, the connection is not always very good, so there's a backup system that if you cannot show the real time, you show something from the day before. And sometimes something very, very embarrassing happened. I remember at the Venice Biennale, we were showing data actually from a few days before, and a couple in France Culture, TV and radio were there asking us to comment on that. And of course, it didn't make sense because it was a different time and a different day, but we couldn't tell them, so we had to make up a story about that. So but I think it's good if machine fails. It's how then evolution can progress.
Well, I actually think that while working with many layers in projects, or a complexity of many different material aspects, electronic aspects, etc., it's very important that one have a kind of vague goals, so that you don't really, you work as what is on the way you see what's working. Because if you have too much of a set idea, you will never manage to reach that idea. So it's very, and also since you're working usually in collaborative, there are many different peoples involved, and to not stop the process because one team or a couple of individuals can't communicate with other ones because something is not working. It's very important to be very kind of careful, like how you progress and how you test things. And that's also the whole thing of the prototyping, I think. You prototype all the time to see how things works. And also in relation to that, it's very, very much about modulation, because one thing is to develop what you call the machine. Another thing is actually how is it working, or what is it doing, and how do you actually design with what it can do. And that, I think, is the most interesting. How do you actually modulate that, and how do you fine-tune that so the performance qualities that you're interested in come about?
For me, if I can add to this course, is well, beside all the kind of obvious technical failures that came across a few times, I think one issue that I was always quite curious about is, like, in systemic terms, like failure would be that, no? Like when the system suddenly it doesn't find alternative routes and suddenly stops. And you know, if you compare that idea with for instance, our experiences or experiments, installations, for me the sort of bigger failure so far is somehow the incapacity to keep on communicating with the project, to be in touch with the project. Like, for instance, even in the moment you finish the installation and you suddenly have to leave because you go somewhere else, and suddenly you realize that you didn't really design or thought about how you kept in touch in such an efficient way, and as well as at the end of the installation, of the exhibitions, what do you do next? And you know, that in a way can be thought as a kind of, you know, typical design problem of how do you know, mantle and dismantle things. But really it's more than that, no? It's about, if you think as a project as a kind of alive or a sort of evolutionary project, is how do you keep it alive, no? How do you manage to kind of keep this evolution carrying on? And I think that's, for me, it's quite...
Somehow, I think in our failure, like the failure that we feel more as a failure, because the failure Carlo talked about, to me, feel like a success. In a way, I consider the machine always fails in something, and from this needs to evolve. But that I don't feel it as a failure. What I feel as a failure are the issue in format and how you interact with the machine after is on one side format, and on the other how you interact with the machine after is exhibited in a museum. No, also the format is very important. Sometimes you concentrate in some part of the design and not in other, and you need to communicate with the engineer and with people that do things, and all of a sudden you have certain failures that are really difficult to bring inside and evolve forward, like what happened with the fibrous structure. No, that there was this very complex team, and the communication between the different parts of the team were so difficult. No, and the material was so heavy and complex. So somehow something we probably want to understand more is this part of the failure, that at the moment we really feel it still as a failure. We didn't find a key to say, okay, we start from that and we evolve it further. That's why we're also thinking about, okay, how do we record the installation? How do we have systems that register the saturation of the installation? No? When to reach a limit, how do you switch from that, or how can this machine maybe?
I mean, the kind of failure, for people that don't know the fibrous structure piece that was installed in Istanbul last year, it was a larger scale, quite big piece of concrete in a gallery that translated a series of working models into what turned into several tons of stringy concrete, which begs questions about a certain kind of failure I'm especially interested in right now, which is the failure of translation, i.e., I mean, one of the interesting things about a prototyping-driven sensibility is that it operates at a certain kind of scale of a working model, or particularly at this phase in interactive architectures, at the scale of a kind of installation space. You see lots of funny lobby things, lots of interactive circulatory spaces. The question of how do ideas in that form get translated into another kind of architecture we'd recognize more like buildings. You know, and there's all kinds of interesting examples of failure today of that, like things that made good sense as a coffee table, when they become a building in Dubai, it gets a little creepy. You know, the translation was too quick, or, I mean, it's, I think, a serious conceptual form of failure more than mechanical or material.
When I was thinking about this roundtable, actually, I was discussing with Marco, and I was thinking, okay, if I would make a question to the other speaker, what would I ask? And I would probably ask, which kind of contribution can architectural machine, make to the maybe construction industry, which is not architecture in a way, no? How do you translate architectural machine? How do you actualize them? And which kind of impact have on other branches of architecture that somehow we consider, but we don't consider so much?
Just kind of wanted to follow up to the first comment. I mean, in response to kind of failure, I think the thing is that the system has to be given over to someone else. Like, I think the water pavilion is an interesting one, because I don't think the intelligence is actually in the pavilion itself. It's actually how people respond to it, how it becomes a tool and an instrument. I mean, I think the fact sometimes that we design systems, we kind of think that we get it all figured out. But the real purpose, I think, of a lot of these things is to actually bring it over and allow people the ability to actually use it and misuse it. And I think that's where you start thinking of it less as a kind of object and an installation and a real kind of performance criterion, because people are inherently very curious and also very intelligent in their playful ways of actually appropriating whatever we actually put out there in a certain capacity. That's something that we've actually really enjoyed by doing these kind of live events. You design a system with a certain kind of framework to get, let's say, something working, because I still think at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, then people don't engage at all. But you do have to allow a certain enabling to allow people to actually find themselves in the piece, and then it becomes something a lot more than actually what you kind of set out as your goal. I don't know, I think that's the real interest about working in a kind of prototypical way, that you allow people in a certain context to figure really what the purpose of these things actually are. And I thought the children playing with your wall makes a lot of sense. I mean, because it doesn't trivialize the people actually, in a sense. You know, they have a lot of capacity to use things in really interesting ways.
Actually, I think this type of most of the projects we saw today, I think, have a very interesting dimension that, we all know how traditional architecture works. So we've all done it. So you do something very, very, very nice, very sexy, and then you send a photographer, they take pictures, and then that's it. I mean, you don't care anymore. It can be Corbusier in Pessac, and then it took 30 years to Philippe Boudon to go back there and see actually that the stuff had become something completely different because the users really radically transformed it and changed it. And but still, what is still published, what was published for 30 years, were still the pictures, the beautiful pictures you take at the beginning. And I always thought that this was a limit of architecture. I think that some of the projects, this new type of machine projects that we've seen today, force us to actually follow the architecture and follow the over time and follow the interaction with the users, as you were saying. So that's that becomes much more difficult for architects. It's much more difficult. I mean, it's very easy. You put everything beautiful, take the pictures, publish it in Domus, and then you're done. And then other people will publish it, but you don't care anymore. You don't. So I think it's a different process that's more tricky, but I think much more exciting.
Hello. It seems to me that one of the common feature is of all the people here is that if it doesn't fail, we are not happy. Like, imagine if you play games, like all of us are a compulsive gambler. Like, we need adrenaline that half an hour now, there is the opening, nothing works. What we do. And this we all love. And this is, in a way, like, if we could go through the project, and I was talking to Carlo before, there were this American illustrator called Goldberg, famous for the Goldberg machines. They were like illustrations from the 30s. They're incredibly complex machine to do very silly and things. There's the bird and etc. Recently was a Fischli and Weiss, the way things go, installation, etc. So it seems that all of us, we love this kind of thing. Carlo say, okay, let's make a water pavilion, never done before, 1,000 sensor. No, that's not enough. Let's make the roof goes up and down. Yeah. No, can we do something more? Eventually could fly. Yeah. And we always, or even the chair, I was really fascinated by the chair that, if you forgive me, but like in a way it's exciting. It looks like we made this, the perfect chair, and at the end we have a chair that doesn't stand up. But if we would push forward. We would forward until finally breaks or doesn't work, and this we like. And also this makes not so easy to get into the building construction business, I would say. That runs on different principles.
Actually, I mean, you're right. We didn't really thought about the fact that some of the chair wouldn't stand by themselves, because we were so focused on the fact that they should stand when people sit on it that we just didn't think of the chair when it was left over and alone in a corner. So, but that actually, I would say there is two very different things. It's really weird because we all know that failure on a more global scale. I mean, not for each. I mean, in the society in general, we all know that failure is a very strong things toward a new discovery and all that. We all know the story of Alfred Nobel, for example, who, I mean, his brother died because of the nitroglycerin, but Alfred Nobel would, I mean, almost died as well, but finally he were a bit more lucky and he didn't die, and he invented dynamite. So failure sometimes, I mean, lead us to great achievements. But the thing is that I wouldn't really call it failure. I would say it's more a matter of chance, and a good scientist always provoke it. You know, they provoke some kind of failure in a sense. It's not a true failure. It's a failure which is a part of many different successes, and it's, I mean, you have to provoke the chance in a sense, and the good scientist knows that. So there is this aspect which is, let's say, almost a methodology. And then there is the failure on a more ideological level, which is intimately linked to what we think in the Western civilization, at least. And I would say that, I mean, we all live in a Western civilization, either in Eastern civilization or not. And this ideology, in a sense, it's about the failure, but not the failure of machines or mechanism, but the failure of nature. And it comes from the Renaissance. And at the Renaissance, I mean, it was the very beginning of the thinking of the man being able to do nature, I mean, to replicate nature, because nature was supposed to be perfect, but not really perfect. So we would be able to make it even more perfect because God is more perfect than nature, and He made us among everything else. The most perfect creation of God was the man. So that's why we were supposed to improve everything else in nature, and this became a strong ideology in Western thinking. And that's what we see just every day in biotechnology and all that. I mean, we consider, for example, dysfunctioning or a couple of diseases as the true failure, and not the medicine, not the failure of the temporary failure of the, let's say, the anti-AIDS pills or something like that. You know, we don't consider it as a failure in a sense. You know, it's just, I mean, we didn't find something yet, but we will find it. So I would make, in a sense, a distinction between those two things. There is on one side an ideology, and on another side a matter of methodology of research, in a sense, something which is just part of research as it is, and as it always has been, I would say.
I think, does this work? I totally agree with that. And to me, what's always very interesting to think about risk-taking, because in a project, and all these projects usually join many different issues. And if you would be in, for instance, an industry doing product development, you need to make sure those risks are minimal. If you can push it, you want to do that complete product or something. But what I think is common between everything today is that there is a bit too high of a risk involved in each project. Like you were saying, we want that, we need to push that, and that's also what makes it innovation somehow. But it's also handling of that. And when you start speaking to construction companies, I mean, their main issue is, of course, zero risk-taking, which I find quite interesting. I mean, they want to make sure that they don't fail. The thing that we deliver to them would not fail. So that I think that's sort of an issue that I work a lot with, which is actually trying to somehow maybe convince someone that the risk is lesser than it actually is. Well, I'm more personally interested in getting that risk to be higher, to push things, basically.
Yeah, but on the other end, like if you, another thing that's interesting in that sense is that you can also have a quite opportunistic attitude, like meaning, you know, within a certain kind of diagrammatic way of working, somehow the fitness criteria or the evaluation criteria can change. Actually, you can set them or you can somehow evolve them. And I think it's, you know, part of the fun is that as well. And I think in that sense what matters is, again, this level of communication, like the fact that you exchange with a manufacturer, with somebody who actually challenges you, and then, you know, it pretends no failure on that level. Maybe you can be opportunistic and slightly change the criteria, and you know, but that in a way is also informing the project, and the project will adapt to that. And you know, there is a sort of open-endedness to that, which I think is quite interesting, and which goes back in a way to the way also nature works. You know,
I think what I was trying to tease out at a certain degree is maybe to get you to respond to the particular kinds of failure you're experiencing in this sort of work at this stage in its development. This is very, for the most part, it's amongst a group of people who are early on in their careers that are in fact founding what will become decades of work related to what we're seeing today. And the point I'd probably try and make is that all forms of failure aren't equal, and the forms of failure that are most compelling within a discipline are the ones in which other people can learn also. The kind of classic definition of an empirical experiment within a field of science. You know, other researchers get the failure, and with that are forced to think about other forms of research or experiment. And I am struck by very distinct kinds of failure today emerging in this work, which is quite interesting, I think, for the way in which it coalesces a shared body of thinkers or artists or architects working on it. That's, and what I was trying to put on the table is specifically your word in the topic today of machines, and the idea of architecture as a machine, which you're drawing out to distinguish this kind of architecture apparently from other kinds of architecture, where you don't often see the word machine attached to it. Now, what it provokes, of course, with an audience like this is the question of at what point did architecture stop being a machine? I mean, can we conceive of an architecture, in fact, that was never a machine? If you think of the tools that architects use and designers, the invention of things like perspective, stereometric geometries that are machines for producing images that can then lead to construction of a certain kinds of form. We know building itself is a deeply technological, and has been throughout its life, you know, for centuries and centuries, a deeply machine-driven form of production. Those are two clear kinds of machines that are in fact almost the definition of the field of architecture. But in the modern sense, if one goes back now, and I was struck by Marie-Ange's introduction at the beginning of providing a kind of prehistory to today, that in her presentation, and I think it's probably related largely to the collection, is a sort of 30 to 40 year span where suddenly some old people seem pretty interesting, we all know. Because in fact they're laying the groundwork for a kind of sensibility that's very familiar today in terms of either networks, machines, automated forms of thinking. I think that's a game that's just opening up today, in fact, that is forcing us to almost redefine the discipline itself through the idea of a machine. And if you think of the 20th century and Corb starting with the house as a kind of machine for living in, there's obviously deeply within the discipline already an expectation of machines being pervasive in how we think and understand space. In the mid-20th century, we get the arrival of Gideon. Mechanization takes command. So machines at that level are mechanical and electrical. Banham's PhD, written here in the 1950s, talking about the well-tempered environment, which is effectively the electrification of architectural space. All of that points to certain kinds of machines that I'm struck maybe at a certain level today, because the machines are there, but they're in a different form, it seems. And I think it's where the difference lies that gets super interesting today. The machines today are certainly looking different than the big mechanical robots that you showed with Archigram's Mechanical City. You know, the machine is a big robot that can move through. Clearly, digital computational technologies are a different kind of machine, and I'm wondering if there's a way in which your thinking about today's machines is trying knowingly to distinguish itself from some of these former models, or if in fact there's some very strong lessons to learn from that earlier history. I'm thinking especially of the sort of things that Marie-Ange was showing. Are there lessons embedded in that we can now get to through the kinds of tools and systems that are available now?
I don't know. I have the impression that somehow I think it was mentioned in the Renaissance. And I think that's quite interesting, because somehow I think architecture has always been a machine, in bracket. But it's like the consciousness that architecture is a machine is a different thing. than architecture being a machine. Like somehow I see the archigram like considering themselves like something different from the construction industry. Okay, that's a construction, we create the vision of the machine, but probably what we are trying to do today, or with this type of machine, as I see it myself, is really engage with the materiality of the machine itself. We believe they are architectural machine, and they are not. That's why I was asking about the construction industry in a way, no? Because somehow I think, actually, we can create a sort of dialogue. We can probably intervene in a certain way. I mean, that's somehow where I see a bit of, but the question probably was for you.
Yeah, it's true that we can make a PhD on the idea of machine from the Renaissance to modernist time, machine habitée. You were quoting René Banham and so on. Yes, of course, it's a very exciting story. And I don't know, maybe for this symposium, the idea was to consider the machine as a conceptual tool, and something Claudia was talking about materiality. Maybe just something material, just something which is there that you can use, which is a device, and not anymore, I would say, something transcendent or beyond us, or device of representation. I think that sometimes we were talking with Philippe about Philippe is talking about a kind of literality, I don't know in English, of the object. Yes, you want to, yeah. And so I think, yes, that this is this idea of an horizontality of all the procedures and process, and then we are working in a different way. And when I was talking about Zephyrotarch, for instance, because he's talking about phylogenetic machine, about his work, and at the end, he's talking about the end of anthropology. So we have both concepts at the same time. And you want to add something?
Because I think it's highly related, those two notions of failure and machines. It leads us right to the idea of computation in a sense. Because when you think of computation and when you speak with scientists today, and I would say when we think of it almost in a post-Bruno Latour epistemology, you see that, for example, in laboratories, either engineer or researcher in pharmaceutics or in aeronautics industry, then do not make a physical model anymore. I mean, we know that Nervi, for example, Pierluigi Nervi, was making only physical model because he only believed in physical models before building his gigantic structures. But today it's exactly the other way around. I mean, we believe only in computation because the level of precision which is allowed by computation and the fact that it's discrete, I mean, this difference between a continuous procedure which comes from the physical world and the discrete procedure which comes from the abstract world of the logician and mathematician from the mid-19th century until now is so incredibly huge that we can almost consider it not as a new industrial revolution. At least on my side, I don't think of it as an industrial revolution. I think of it as the difference between the Stone Age and the age of steel, iron, the Iron Age, and the one in between, but I don't know the word in English, bronze. Bronze Age. You see, so because I mean this difference between continuous and discrete between something which was a mechanical thing, for example, in the 19th century, but which was still subjected to fail, to failure. I mean, today when there is a bug in a computer, it's only because ultimately a computer is physical, it's atoms. If it would be unphysical, if it would be only pure logic, it just wouldn't fail, because we can prove, for example, for some software, that they will just never fail at all. And all the critical software which are, for example, in airplane automatic navigation system and all that, they are all proved by mathematicians. So the failure is on the side of physicality. And today we consider, and it's I'm mentioning exactly I think a very interesting young epistemologist in France, which is something like a post-Latour epistemologist called Frank Varenne, and he's saying that because of the computation, the very nature of computation, nature became a bad model of itself. And that's why we don't want to replicate nature, we do just something else. It's a computational ecology because even the nature cannot replicate himself, and we are in the world of modelization, of computational simulation, etc. And all those things, all the idea of mechanism is changing. And regarding architecture, in a sense, it is a machine in an old-fashioned way, but according to our very contemporary idea of what is a machine, I mean a computer, which is able to reinvent himself almost, it's not a machine. I mean, it can only be a machine if we consider it with all criteria. Because it will, I mean, architecture will never compute anything as long as we defined it with the actual criteria. If we make it become a computer, then it will be a machine.
But I'm not sure I agree with you, but let me tell you how we see it. And I think this morning Brett said, thinking this stuff here, there's more power than there was 50 years ago in one of the big mainframes. Now, if you go to MIT, you can still see some of the mainframes. And what they look like, you have a big basement, and you have a huge piece of equipment. And everything there, all the architecture, was dictated by the machine. So the machine was so big, so powerful, that everything had to adapt to it. The temperature, the humidity, everything had to follow the machine. And then think about what happened in the 90s. Personal computer, you still had were chained to a place, and you couldn't move from there, and they were very bulky. And think about Olivetti's first portable computer. Sure, you could was portable probably with a trolley or something. So it was very big, heavy stuff. And then think about the whole stuff now is packed here, is network, is becoming basically what is happening is that we're going much more to something that's merging bits and atoms into one single thing. Now it is clear that in the 50s, when Piano and Rogers were thinking about, wow, let's try to give shape to this idea of the machine, to the big mainframe, then you have the Centre Pompidou. Today is going to be very, very different. And to me, I think it's also going to be something that's much less machine, because the machine is disappearing. The network is appearing, the machine is disappearing. Bits and atoms are fusing together. It's a question of augmenting. The machine is nowhere and everywhere, because it's just the bits augmenting the atoms. And I think this is the architecture that we need to give shape to. This is the same question that Corbusier had. Corbusier had a different world out there. He saw all these pipes and stuff, and he said, well, mechanical civilization needs to find its architectural expression. Today, the same question applies. Digital civilization needs to find its architectural expression. What we've done in the past 10 years was nice, funny shapes and blobs. It was fun, but now I think is when we need to find an answer to that question. And so I think that's, and to me, I don't know if it might be, but because I don't know how much time there is, but it would be really nice to hear actually from you guys who saw our projects, because I think we're all trying to answer that question. What will be next? But you could tell us, are we going in the right direction? Are we bumping into a wall? Are we, I mean, we are not sure. And I think it would be good to hear some of the comments from.
Perfect moment to open it up to the floor. Should we do that?
Yeah.
Here, I'll carry the microphone. Somebody with a question. Give me a direction to walk here.
on the failure, like the question for me is how do you build in failure within academic environment? Because everybody wants a success. I mean, we talked about that. Like how, because the failure at this point, like maybe Philippe talked about, it's very obvious when the material doesn't perform the way you thought. Like in a digital environment, everything possibly you can make it work. But when you translate that in a different environment, that system becomes very obvious, which is if you don't go outside of the digital environment, you can never really test it. So I'm just wondering, how do you build in a kind of failure as not a goal, but the ways in which we can actually build in within academic practice? So it's just a question.
Nobody wants to answer.
No, I don't know. I think that the academic environment is probably one of the best one to make all this testing and experiment. I don't think it's by chance that most of us, as far as I know, are also teaching or involved into academic activities, because the school, like if we work together for a professional job, actually we shouldn't fail, because then there is liabilities, lawyers, etc. If we are in a school environment, that's not so relevant. Like the important was the experiment we've done, and this is a freedom that nowhere else you can find. Then, of course, the next step is how would this eventually ever reach the building sector and the real estate business? That's probably the big challenge. But the school per se is a lovely place, I guess, both for who teach, who learn, students, researchers. I don't know if I understood.
Let's see a question. I thought there was a hand back here. Questions?
Do you think that maybe this question of failure can be rephrased in terms of a question about deterministic process that was somehow natural to architecture, and that we are maybe evaluating the issue of failure from the point of view of deterministic process, while the new types of maths, or let's say computational approach, is opening us to more of this kind of non-deterministic systems that are different in nature to begin with. Maybe, again, probably a question for Philippe or you, Brett.
I don't think we took such a distance with deterministic procedure or processes in a sense, because even if we don't use it today as in a very strict sense, like the Laplacian definition of it, it's still part of what research and science can be. I mean, if we don't believe in something that can be deterministic at some point, then it just means that we don't believe in any kind of law for calculation. I mean, any kind of law in science, any kind of rules, you see. So I'm not sure that it's related in a sense. But ultimately, maybe what you are more into it's what is the place for empirical research into I mean into architecture, but I would say everywhere. And just I think that ultimately research is just always empirical. It has never been something else than empiricism, you see. When we take a look back in history, I mean, just the evolution of science reveals this fact, you see, as something like an evidence, you see, but there is this strong dialectics between determinism, which is one of the foundation of science, in a sense. At least you have to believe in it. even if some scientists like Hilbert, for example, or even Max Planck, they were saying that ultimately the foundation in science don't exist, you know. But you have to believe in the fact that you will have some foundation somewhere, otherwise you can't do anything. But in practically speaking, research is empirical. So I don't know if I answer.
But somehow I don't know if it's about determinism, but I think the question she made is interesting in a sense, because the failure, as I was saying before, that I feel as failure, are the ones that are not inside of an experiment that I can evaluate in a way. For example, the failure I was talking about in the fibrous structure emerged from the fact that there was a difficulties to exchange with the engineer and to conceive the project in a similar way. And somehow in my way of working, I didn't somehow add a system to acknowledge this failure and then grow from that. And therefore I suffered from it and I felt it was a failure. Different from a failure you can grow from. I don't know if it's a different from deterministic way of looking at structure or calculating structure and a different way of looking at structure, but definitely there was a problem of two logic that would have a difficulties to work together and therefore have a difficulties to acknowledge the failure and grow from that.
Well, I mean, I guess it's also maybe goes back to the comment of Yosuke, like the idea that like the failure or the evaluation of failure should be a mechanism itself. Like it's something that you have to build in such a way that keeps on evolving. Like, you know, one thing is if you have like a sort of idea of what is failure and that's it. One thing is whether, like, you know, that idea or that threshold of failure keeps on evolving, keeps on with.
Like if we say we are working on machine by definition can work or no work. Yeah. So if we say that we want to make a flying machine and we are in the 1236, most likely we're bound to fail. And this is the building industry has a very little space for this attitude experimental. So if we say that we want to make a machine to transform iron into gold, most likely we will find very hard time not to make mistakes. Then still all alchemy is and then molecular chemistry comes from there. So I think it's just what are the parameters of success. I think that there might be that let's say one thing that seems to me very interesting is that we are all working on machines. In some extent, 20th century, machine is synonym of mechanization for industry or mass production, while we do actually, most of us, we do make machines with the spirit of the craftsman. And we are all, most of us, refusing the logic of the mass production. There is this recent book by Richard Sennett about the craftsman. And basically Sennett is saying that thanks to all these digital media, medium and technologies, we are able to get back into a previous condition where the craftsman, to several extents, is what we are all doing.
I mean, one of the things that I was thinking of Philippe's comment about foundations and things that people share. I think if one goes around this table, one of the easy questions to ask would be, why is it that interactivity is assumed in any of the projects that are being worked on today, i.e. that the user and that installation, that object, that panel is going to know something about me and I'm going to then learn something about it through that kind of exchange. If these projects aren't doing that kind of direct form of interaction, the other way we can think of them is that they're a result of what we would call interactive design operations themselves, i.e. operations that can be varied, adjusted, will produce unexpected results because of their own assumed interactive capacity. This shift in space from neutral monolithic models that you could say run for a century through architecture. Mies is the great example. I mean, a space that was just inert. Despite being a heavy prototype or someone who, you know, the space was space. It was universal, it was neutral, it was fixed, beautifully composed. We went in and experienced it and then left. Has been flipped on its head with an assumption today that space or structure will, in some form, be genuinely interactive with those of us that are living in the world with it. And I think that seems to be the basis for getting to an answer that Stefano is asking, which is what's the parameter for success or failure? It looks like that's the particular form of failure that would worry people at this table right now. If I make one of these things and it does nothing with the person that sits down to interact with it, I got a serious problem. That to me is a much more serious problem than whether it stands up or falls down. All buildings or all structures have that problem. And that's why I'm not sure the building construction industry is the real threat here. It's the conceptual tools, it's the ways of working, it's the ability to network together things to actually create forms of interaction. And I'm just wondering then, as a final question, are there examples that you might be looking to consciously around this topic of interactivity, some of which might sit within architecture, allied fields, or in completely other examples that might give you all clues for this kind of assumption about space and structure? Does interactivity have anything other than a bunch of experiments today? Is there a theory of it? Is there a history of it? Are there models that can be learned from that can then be brought to bear on this kind of work? I think it's a really interesting question today, in that those earlier phases of architecture as machines almost always seem to have a theory. Corb had a theory of the modern object before he in fact had the houses that lived like machines. Today it's like we're in the reverse. We have no theory for this kind of a project, but we've got lots of interesting examples emerging. So where do we get that theory, I guess, is the question to close with.
We need a theory, or at least an history of the relation between logics and architecture, I would say.
Yeah, that's right.
Not mechanism and architecture, but logics, because the true mechanization of today is the mechanization of abstraction.
Nice.
And I mean, the expression is not mine. It comes from a French computer scientist, and also from Turing, in essence. Turing had the same definition of what a computer is, a kind of mechanization of abstraction. And this mechanization of abstraction, I think it was never written in architecture, neither a theory, neither a history, because either it is Siegfried Gideon or Rainer Banham.
Yeah.
They made history and theory of mechanization, but not of an abstract mechanization, of a concrete one. And yeah, I think it has to be done in the sense it's ongoing. I don't know.
I think that in architecture field, it's curious that Christopher Alexander got almost forgotten, although old and too young to still he became very, very relevant in computer science discourse, and I would imagine that probably should we read more about these things, we could find a lot of useful paradigm models, etc. I think that in some extent the contemporary debate about architecture is.
I mean, it's a continuity. I mean, it's been a continuous project. I think in the 50s, if you look at things like the Macy's conference, if you look at stuff that was going on at MIT, if you look at people that we sort of appreciate today, like John Fraser and Negroponte, they obviously had interest in systemic issues, but they also opened it up to discourses of cybernetics, of man-machine interfaces. It was kind of given that architecture wasn't in its autonomy, and it had to actually search for other people that were quite like-minded to kind of explore these issues. I don't think anything's really changed. I think to try to isolate what we're doing differently is a mistake. And I also think the issues of materialism is actually what we could do now in a kind of different way, learning from their experimentation, so we don't necessarily repeat their outcomes. And I think we're in a position where we can start to do that and take that on board as a kind of critical project. And I think that has to do more with application. I mean, there was some very provocative ideas from the 50s to today about computation, not just necessarily computations that we understand today. I mean, even chemical computing, all different kinds of ideologies behind different kinds of practices of thinking about computation and materialism. And I mean, those exist. Cedric Price, Fun Palace, all kinds of projects of what interaction could possibly be.
I'm going to pass to Ulrika for a final comment, and we're going to finish that.
Oops. I actually do think that in our practice, anyway, I think so that I don't think so much about interaction while designing. I mean, our first projects was very much literally how do we engage another person to participate in the design or something. And somehow we experienced that it was so forceful, we didn't get anywhere with that. So in a way now it's more of it's literally we're doing architecture, we're designing with a series of materials, and they might have different properties. They might be of stone or wood, or they might be of, electronics or algorithms, or so they're more part of the building blocks in a material luggage. So I agree with Claudia that you talked about at the beginning, that perhaps today it's more interesting to think about this informal materiality and how to design kind of because also that friction of going from the kind of the ideal model or the digital ideal model and getting it out things will happen. And you talked about translation, information or data will get translated and also be affected into kind of the material world. So that's where, as an architect, you have a lot to do also. What happens then, and what are the qualities, and how can we think of this architecturally, and how can we, etc.
Well, I'm going to wrap up, but we didn't touch on it in the conversation at the end, but I think one of the most interesting shifts alongside this sensibility has obviously been a movement towards various collaborative models for how one works today. Today's been a lovely collaboration on its own amongst the people here. Thank you all for coming in, participants, Marie-Ange and Claudia for organizing the day, all of you for coming to the event. We're going to do a quick conversion of this space so that 30 minutes from now we'll begin an evening lecture with Dunn and Rabi,